but they could contribute, and they definitely perpetuate it once it happens. And so it's just, we have to be conscious of that kind of stuff, because, not everybody has to do that to eliminate those foods to be healthy. That's very clear.
Welcome back to another episode of the Peak Performance Life podcast. Today, I am very excited to have a guest on who is an expert, just wrote a book on one of the most important topics that not a lot of people actually talk about in this health world, in this biohacking world, where everyone's talking about just having more energy and things of that nature, which is great. I'm all about that as well. But this topic is the heart, and heart disease, inflammation, all things of that nature is what our guest here is going to talk about. And his name is Dr. Stephen Hussey. He wrote a book called Understanding the Heart: Surprising Insights into the Evolutionary Origins of Heart Disease and Why It Matters. We are very excited to have him on today. Real quick, before we jump into it, if you are a repeat listener, we do ask that you please share this episode if you find value in it, and rate and subscribe and review. That helps more people find us. We don't do external ads, so we really, really appreciate you taking a few seconds just to share, like, rate, review the podcast as well. But Dr. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited to get into this topic with you.
Yeah, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. So yeah, why don't you give the listeners a quick background about yourself and how you got so interested in heart health? And
Yeah. Like many people in this space, all the information I share kind of came from my own health journey. So when I was a kid, I had a lot of inflammatory conditions. I had asthma and allergies. I used to break out in hives all over my body for whatever reason. I had IBS and ultimately ended up with autoimmune type 1 diabetes at age 9, where my body attacked the cells that make insulin. So I no longer make insulin. So I have to give injections every day. And so, my parents and I were kind of thrown into the world of Western medicine to help us manage these conditions or do what we could, and didn't really help in the long run, because in the end, they were just managing the conditions, not figuring out what the cause was and correcting them. And so, as I grew up and got more and more education, and eventually went to chiropractic school, and then got my master's in functional medicine, I learned a lot more about, finding the root cause. But even those degrees were not adequate, I would say, as far as, what I think creates health in general. But I started to learn that, the way I live my life had a direct impact on how I could manage these conditions. And I thought it was interesting that I was never told that by physicians. And so, I did a lot of trial and error, and I'm happy to say that, all those conditions are gone now, aside from the type 1 diabetes. It is collateral damage that was done from that. But yeah, being type 1 diabetic heavily predisposes me to heart disease. And so, for a very long time now, I've been researching heart disease and finding everything I can about how to prevent it. And a lot of what I found is directly contrary to what we're told about heart disease, about what the heart is, about what causes heart disease. And so, I had all this information, and so I ended up eventually writing a book and sharing things on social media, and the book came out in April, and here we are.
Wow. Yeah, I'm excited to get into this. I'm sure you have some statistics about heart health and it being, I know it's one of the top killers. It must be up there, right?
It is the top
Yeah.
in the world. It's the top. It's the most common, I guess, chronic disease. And there's different forms of what we call heart disease or cardiovascular disease. But yeah, it's like cancer may be more in the United States, I'm not sure, but in the world, heart disease is the number one killer, or some component of heart disease contributes to death.
And is heart attack, like, is a heart attack considered heart disease, part of heart disease as well?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, just wanted to clarify on all that. Interesting. Okay. Yeah. So tell us a little bit. So what are some of the common things that are taught, or common ways that people are treating? By the way, I just find this fascinating that, like, this is like the number one killer in the world, and yet I listen to like thousands of episodes of podcasts, and we've done over 50 ourselves here, and I don't think I've heard a specific podcast episode specifically about heart and heart disease, and this is the number one killer in the world. So wow, amazing that more people aren't talking about it. And yeah, excited to dive into it a little more with you here.
Yeah. So yeah, some of the biggest misconceptions, I think, are the big one is that, and the most famous one, I guess, infamous one maybe, is that cholesterol causes heart disease. Is that cholesterol, gets into your bloodstream and sticks to the lining of your arteries and clogs things up and causes heart disease. That is absolutely not true. And it never has been, and it never will be. And then another big misconception that is not as commonly talked about is that the heart is what's moving our blood. The heart is this pump that pushes the blood throughout the body, which is also not entirely true. And so, if we've misunderstood what the role and function of the heart actually is, how we're supposed to, treat the diseases that it gets, especially ones like heart failure and things like that. So that's another big one. Another big mystery that I dug into a little bit is why heart cancer is so rare, because it is one of the rarest forms of all cancer. It does happen, but it's extremely rare. To give people an idea, there's one doctor in Canada who's kind of the closest thing we have to a cardiac oncologist, even though there's no such real thing as that. But he gets referred a lot of cases. He only gets referred like maybe 10 cases a year. So it's a very rare thing to get cancer of the heart, and it's more common that cancer starts somewhere else and spreads to the heart. It's very, very rare that it actually the primary source of cancer is in the heart. So I asked myself that question and found some things about that. Another one is that salt causes high blood pressure, which is also not true. So yeah. And another one is that all heart attacks are caused by blockages in the arteries, which is also not true. That does happen, but it's not the only way that we can get tissue death of the heart. So lots of different mysteries and things.
Those are some big bombs right there that I think a lot of people. So yeah, I mean, we got a lot to cover here, so I want to jump right into this. First, the cholesterol, because this is something as well where it's like, I have a little bit of high cholesterol because I eat more of a high fat, low carb, diet. And so since I started doing that, I feel 100 times better. But yet my only marker that seems a little kind of out of whack these days is cholesterol, even though my HDL is also high and my triglycerides are in a great range. And so, there was some other website, the cholesterol code that I went to, and they, I put in my numbers and they said, oh no, your numbers are good if you're eating high. So there's just so much misconceptions and so many people taking statins, which, have a lot of different opinions about them as well. I personally want to avoid taking them, if I can. But so you tell me, what's your opinion about cholesterol and how it relates or doesn't relate to heart disease?
Yeah, well, I mean, the idea of it, the idea came about when in like the 1950s, heart disease was a growing thing. And so, back in the early 1900s, the field of cardiology wasn't even really a thing because heart disease wasn't as prevalent. And so, but in the 50s, it started to become more and more prevalent. After World War II, heart disease started to grow in prevalence. And so President Eisenhower had a heart attack. Famously, it was all over the news and everything. And so heart disease, everybody was scared, like what's causing this thing, this new disease? And this one guy named Ancel Keys gave everybody an answer. He was a scientist in the University of Minnesota, and he basically did these very poorly done studies that showed a correlation between certain countries that ate more saturated fat and cholesterol and heart disease. However, what he did, there was data from 22 countries available at the time, and he looked at data from the 6 countries that gave him the correlation that he wanted, and he omitted the other countries, the other data. And so later, like maybe 10 years later, 2 other statisticians redid that study and used the data from all 22 countries available and found no correlation. But he gave them the answer. The idea took off. There's that famous cover of Time magazine, look at the frowny face with the bacon and everything.
Yeah, bacon and eggs, even eggs, which to me are like a superfood, and all of a sudden eggs was evil back then.
Yeah, and so the idea took off, and there was a lot of money behind it. There's obviously sugar and cereal industries, grain industries that wanted people to eat more of those foods rather than animal foods and saturated fat, and so they put a lot of money behind it, and it just kind of took off. And it's only recently, maybe the last 10-20 years or so, where people are starting to look at the evidence, and there's lots of studies now showing that there's no correlation. This was never the cause of heart disease. And so people have unnecessarily been avoiding fat. And actually, when they made up that theory, then they went to test it, like Ancel Keys and a lot of other there's like 5 or 6 studies that basically did experiments where they removed saturated fat in people's diet and replaced unsaturated fat in their diet, and replaced it with unsaturated fat. And the more unsaturated fat they ate, the more heart disease they had, the more cancer they had, the more heart attacks they had, the more all-cause mortality they had. And there's like 4 or 5 studies at that time, but it was kind of ignored because the theory had already taken off, and there was a lot of money behind it.
Hold on, just to clarify, because with saturated fat, there was less prevalence of those diseases or more?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Less,
Much less. Yeah. There's one study that showed that with every 22 points of cholesterol went down, there was, I forget it. There was like no, it's for every 30 points that cholesterol went down, there's a 22% higher risk of all-cause mortality.
Wow. Yeah. Got it. So all-cause mortality, right? Not just looking at one marker of heart disease and not looking at specific sample studies. Now, I'll tell you, most people I talk to, and especially just people who go to the doctor or get a checkup or get a blood test and they have high cholesterol, I mean, immediately it's a major concern. Vegans obviously still point to this as like, oh, see, look, everyone has, meat eaters and people have high saturated fat, and that's bad for heart health. And so this narrative is still very strong. There's only you and a couple other people out there really fighting this narrative.
Well, and the thing is that physicians are trained that this is what's causing heart disease. So unless they look into it themselves, they don't necessarily know any better. Which is kind of the sad state of our medical system. But the other thing is that it's the standard of care that if someone has high cholesterol, that you recommend a statin drug. And if you don't do that and something happens to that person,
right,
regardless of what happened, then you didn't do the standard of care and you're liable. So that's kind of the mess that doctors are in. And that's not an excuse for them, but I'm just saying that that's the situation. I mean, I was recommended a statin drug when I was 20 years old, not because my cholesterol was high, just because that's the standard of care for someone who's been type 1 diabetic as long as I have. Doesn't have anything to do with cholesterol numbers. And there's actually plenty of associational research, which is not the best form of research, but associational research that shows that cholesterol level, like total cholesterol levels between 200 and 250, associate with the lowest all-cause mortality from everything. And that's above what they recommend. And that LDL cholesterol, which is supposed to be quote unquote below 100 is what they say. But between 100 and 150 associates with the lowest all-cause mortality from everything. And cholesterol is incredibly important to our bodies. The last thing I want to do is aggressively lower it because it is used in so many things. And that's why, there's tons of studies out there that show all the side effects of statin drugs, like memory loss, muscle dysfunction, muscle pain, sexual dysfunction, because all of our hormones are made from cholesterol, tons and tons of different side effects from these drugs. And there's even a study that came out very recently this year that shows that using statins is not preventing heart disease. It's just not. Lowering cholesterol is not preventing it.
So you're not a fan of statins, I take it?
No, not at all. They're not fixing the problem.
Yeah. And the thing is, right, they must be probably the best-selling prescription drug, or they must be up there if they're not number one.
They're one and two are like pain meds, and then statin drugs. Yeah.
So there's so much of a business behind it now that it becomes very difficult to change the narrative, right? When there's so many billions of dollars being made on this, and the narrative is so strong, to turn that around, man, that's tough. But let's get into also like, so what is, I'm sure people are wondering, okay, it's not cholesterol. So what is it actually? And I have heard that, the sample sizes they took where the cholesterol was high, it was also inflammation was extremely high in those people, right?
Yeah. So, we do have some evidence that certain forms of cholesterol associate with more heart disease, but it's very important to say that's an association. Okay. We can't say that one causes the other. That's just, we're seeing them both at the same time. It's like if you're standing on the sidewalk and you see a traffic jam and you also see the clouds in the sky, and you can't say the clouds caused the traffic jam or the traffic jam caused the clouds. You can't say that. All you can say is that they're happening at the same time. And that's what association means. So there are some associational studies that show that like damaged cholesterol, like oxidized cholesterol or LP(a), or small dense particles are associated with more rates of heart disease. But that's because there are things in the body that are damaging those molecules. And those same things that are damaging those molecules are also damaging the lining of the artery. So there's inflammation and oxidative stress in the body that is damaging the lining of the artery, and the body has to respond to that, or else if it doesn't, then that artery could get so damaged that it ruptures, and now we're bleeding out, which is a much bigger problem than hardening of an artery. And so the body uses cholesterol and minerals and various things as pretty much like spackle to patch up the inflammation. And so that's why cholesterol is clogged, or it gets not clogged, but like deposited in the lining of an artery. It's because the body's using it to repair something that can't repair itself. So that's the real cause of atherosclerosis, which is hardening of the arteries, which is one aspect of cardiovascular disease.
Yeah. Interesting. So, and by the way, so the things you mentioned, certain forms of cholesterol, I've heard of those too, and the particles, and I can't remember exactly the wording you just used, but I've heard, so the normal blood tests, you go to your doctor, you get total cholesterol, you get HDL, and you get LDL. So, but you're not getting the measurements of the things you just mentioned, right? The things that truly matter, you have to do probably a more in-depth test that not many doctors are doing, right?
Yeah, more in depth, and I guess more expensive too. And I would argue that you don't need them, because regardless of if you have elevated levels of those things or not, I could tell you what to do to prevent them. And it's going to be good for you whether you have those levels that are high or not anyways. So if it's too expensive or your insurance doesn't cover it, I wouldn't spend the money. I'd spend the money on making the dietary changes and lifestyle changes that you need to, which are pretty much the same. The things that reduce inflammation and oxidative stress are going to be the same regardless of what your blood work says. I can look at someone or I can listen to their symptoms and tell whether they're healthy or not, what things they need to change. Testing can be this motivator. If you see it, you're like, oh, this is bad. It can help you, and then you can test it later, see if it's improved after you've made changes. That can be a motivator. It can be good in that sense. But yeah, the treatment is not going to change too much, whether I know if there's inflamed or damaged cholesterol or not.
So the key so essentially what you're saying is the normal cholesterol numbers, total cholesterol, LDL and HDL are maybe we won't say meaningless statistics, but you don't really look at those that much. You're much more concerned with probably inflammation markers.
Yeah, definitely not meaningless, but I'd say that they're way overemphasized. They're way over utilized. Way too much focus put on them. And I think they've been a huge distraction into the actual causes of heart disease. One of which, like you said, like we've been talking about, is inflammation and oxidative stress, which you can take different numbers of that too. Like high sensitivity to C-reactive protein is just kind of a good measure of general inflammation in the body. Or you could get a GGT liver enzyme, which is a marker of how much oxidative stress is happening in the liver specifically. But I guess most importantly is you want to get numbers that reflect insulin resistance or I guess your status of insulin resistance. So that's going to be the trig to HDL ratio, which is within the lipid panel. You can get those two numbers, a triglyceride and an HDL, and you divide one by the other. And then a fasting insulin level, which is...
Real quick, what is an optimal level? So if someone knows their triglycerides and knows their HDL, what's an optimal and what's a non-optimal level there?
Yeah, generally, if you divide triglyceride by HDL, you want it to be 1.5 or lower. And generally, I would say, triglycerides themselves should be lower than 150, but really optimally lower than 100. Would be ideal. And then a fasting insulin level, the labs always say, oh, lower than 20 is fine, but really you want it lower than 10 and optimally lower than 5. So yeah, but fasting insulin is very rarely taken. Most physicians will not take it. They don't even understand why you would want to take it, but it's the best marker of whether or not we're insulin resistant or not, regardless of if we're diabetic or have prediabetes or whatever. You can be insulin resistant way before you become diabetic. So that's the most important test for insulin resistance, in my opinion.
Interesting, because I don't think, I've been taking the Inside Tracker blood tests. I don't believe I saw anything regarding fasting insulin. I know they have the C-reactive protein, they have the HbA1c, whatever, that inflammation marker, which those two I imagine are important inflammation markers to look at, right?
Well, HbA1c is more of a blood sugar average over 3 months or so. HSCRP is the inflammation one.
Got it.
Yeah, yeah.
Got it. But if you
But
have if you have elevated levels of insulin, that might indicate, I don't know, maybe a bad diet or could be causing inflammation, or you could be pre-diabetic or whatever, right?
yeah, so you could have normal blood sugar and normal hemoglobin A1C, and still have a high fasting insulin. It just means your body's having to take more insulin to keep those other numbers where they're at, which means you're insulin resistant. And that can be present for 10, 20 years before it ever becomes pre-diabetes or diabetes. And so all the issues that come along with being insulin resistant are happening for 20 years before there's ever any intervention. And so that's the big issue there. Is that's why that number is so important. I mean, I've had, super fit looking 20-year-olds come into my clinic, and I'll take their fasting insulin and it's elevated, and they look fit and healthy.
Why do you think that is? And so maybe let's kind of transition a little bit into why do you think their fasting insulin may be high? And also you mentioned, about reducing inflammation and oxidative stress. Kind of what are some of the things around that?
Yeah. So I think the main reason that people become insulin resistant is the consumption of vegetable oils. And then they add fuel to the fire by having processed carbohydrates in the form of, grains and sugars and things like that. So yeah, those are the main reasons for insulin resistance, for high fasting insulin. And but there's also other reasons that, you can have chronic stress can cause insulin resistance. You can have toxin exposure. You can have inflammation that causes insulin resistance. So lots of different things there. Yeah, and then as far as like oxidative stress and inflammation, the number one thing you could do that you have control over is change your diet. Stop eating inflammatory foods. Stop eating vegetable oil, stop eating grains, stop eating legumes, beans, lentils, peas, things like that. Stop eating, be very conscious of how plant toxins affect your body, because different plant toxins can cause inflammation in different people. And so really it's sticking to the animal foods and low toxin vegetables and things like that, or just be knowledgeable of how they affect you. So there's that, but then there's also external toxin exposures, everything from heavy metals to mold to plastics to all kinds of different chemicals and substances that humans have made that contribute to this inflammatory state of our bodies. And so yeah, there's that, and then there's psychological stress. Definitely. So there's actually a few studies out there that show that these traditional markers that we track for heart disease, like cholesterol and inflammation and things like that, are not explaining or not doing a good job of explaining why people have heart attacks, because lots of people who have heart attacks don't have those elevated markers. There's actually quite a bit of evidence for that. And so we have to look at different markers. So I would argue that the markers of insulin resistance are more important. I would argue that different markers of inflammation is important, but also markers of how stressed we are, or balance in our stress response, which is something that's not a lot of emphasis is put on that, because you can't make too much money from saying, hey, reduce your stress.
Right. And there's not like a hey, read this book and your stress will be gone or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Like there's
it
kind of a lot
work.
of internal personal development and work and stuff that needs to be done
and,
there,
and
which is
changing of your life. There are things in your life that sometimes you can't get rid of, or there's some things that you don't want to get rid of, but they're causing you stress, and you have to kind of come to terms with doing that and getting rid of those things.
Yeah. So kind of to recap, some of the things we've talked about a lot on previous episodes about lowering inflammation in the body. Obviously, the listeners know my story and how I've recommended, healthy fats. It's why I eat more of a lower carb. I do introduce some healthy carbs, like some sweet potatoes when I'm doing heavy workouts and things like that. But like you said, carbs with the seed oils. So, think French fries or any kind of fried food is really, really bad. Really, just really, I look at it as poison, just like sugar. And it's like a lot of these things that cause inflammation in the body, it's the same things that cause you to gain weight. It's the same things that cause you to potentially be pre-diabetic, right? We're talking, the seed oils, the fried foods, the sugars. I also cut out grains, which is, another one where it's like the old school mentality of, oh, whole grains are part of a healthy diet, right? And that's why the paleo diet, I think, has been so beneficial to myself and so many other people in terms of lowering inflammation in the body, eliminating grains. You mentioned a couple other somewhat controversial ones, right? The, peas and beans, and, obviously vegans are getting a lot of their protein from beans, and they're eating lots of whole grains and things of that nature. So a lot of people would kind of argue that. What is it about kind of, but I'm myself also, I'm very careful. I've also researched a lot, and, Dr. Gundry and some others talk a lot about different plants that, tomatoes as a nightshade is one where, a lot of people are kind of maybe aware of that one. It doesn't affect everyone that way, but, a certain percentage it does. I am mindful of not really eating beans as well. Every once in a while I'll have pea or an organic pea protein, but why is it that you specifically stay away from maybe legumes and peas?
I just don't think so. Like you mentioned, like vegans are getting a lot of their protein from that, and I would argue that they're not, because that protein is bound to cellulose, and it's very hard for us to absorb. And so we don't have a fermentation chamber like a gorilla does, or like other animal, like a cow or whatever. They ferment that stuff, and they can extract the protein from the cellulose, whereas we can do that a little bit, but not really that much. And so, like, I think that like the true utilizable protein from a plant is about 50%, whereas the true utilizable protein from an animal is like 90-92%, something like that. So our digestive systems are designed to extract protein from animal foods, like direct absorption of it. Like that's why you have such a long small intestine and a short large intestine. That's just how it is for us. And so legumes don't really have, they have a lot of nutrients, but it's really hard for us to absorb those nutrients. Also, the plant toxin phytic acid or phytate is very prevalent in beans and legumes and things like that, and those will bind up minerals. And so all those minerals that beans and lentils have, we don't really absorb much of those either. So it's just very hard for us to extract nutrients from those foods. So just because there's a nutrient in a food doesn't mean that if we eat it, our digestive system is designed to absorb it. And that's just how it is. That's, if you look at how we are as humans and what our digestive system looks like, that's just how it is. So I just don't think that they're some people react very poorly to beans as well, but I don't think that they're, I think that in some cases they do perpetuate autoimmunity. I'm not saying they cause it, but once autoimmunity happens, they can be triggering it over and over again. Lots of plant toxins will do that. I don't know that plant toxins trigger or cause autoimmunity in the first place. I think that could be other things, but they could contribute, and they definitely perpetuate it once it happens. And so it's just, we have to be conscious of that kind of stuff, because, not everybody has to do that to eliminate those foods to be healthy. That's very clear, just based on what we observe. But for some people, it's the difference between being healthy and having symptoms. So we just have to use that as a tool in our toolbox of something that we could try, is to eliminate more and more plant toxins as we are going along our health journey.
Yeah. I'm like you, because I had this experience with the inflammation in my arms, and like you said, you had inflammation. It's like people like us seem to be the ones that really are very careful, because we maybe we're more sensitive to it than the normal person, but it's like, we feel it when, and so, yeah, it's important. I agree. And, it's funny, there was the old, remember, I don't know if you remember when you were a kid, maybe I'm dating myself, but I was like, beans are good for your heart. The more you eat, the more you fart. And then, when you think about that now, it's like, well, something that you eat and makes you fart probably isn't good for your gut health, right? Or
Yeah,
like,
it's because your body's trying to ferment it, extract nutrients from it, but it just can't. And so it creates a lot of gas.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting. And yeah, we have heard of people having gut issues or inflammation or things of that nature. So it's just something to be aware of. Look, if you've been eating them and you're doing great with them and you feel great, then great. But definitely, if you're not feeling great, feeling like you're lacking energy, or maybe have high inflammatory markers, then, these are all things to be aware of that, not many people are really talking about. So I want to talk about, so first of all, real quick, what is it? Maybe you can give the listeners really quick, like, what are some of the staple foods that you're eating in your diet on the regular?
Yeah, I mean, I center my diet around animal foods. So um, mostly red meat, beef and pork, and then I do eggs, and then I'll add some vegetables here and there, like some um, low toxin vegetables. Like right now, it's summer squashes and mushrooms and things like that. I do dairy, like I do raw fermented dairy
Hmm.
in the form of yogurt and cheese, and I have a source here for that. What else do I do?
And the meat and the
Yeah,
eggs, are you focused on grass fed,
yeah, I do,
organic
and
grass fed?
I don't, if you look at them, they're not too much nutritionally different, but way better for the environment, way better for the animal
Yeah.
that I'm eating. So that's where I vote with my dollar in that. I also support local farmer rather than big business. So I get all my grass fed meat from a local farmer around here.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, yeah.
Okay, great. So yeah, seems like so it's pretty much, paleo, more
Mhm.
heavy animal meats, organic pasture raised eggs, grass fed meat. Yeah, interesting. So I also, you mentioned a few other interesting things that I want to get to here. So salt and blood pressure.
Yeah,
Talk a little bit about that.
yeah. So I mean, there's this idea that more salt causes high blood pressure, and that usually it comes from the fact that um your body wants to hold on to minerals, and so if we create this, the way that it has to hold on to them is it has to resorb fluid, because the minerals are dissolved in water, and so when your kidneys are filtering out things, the idea is that if we have too many minerals to reabsorb, we'll reabsorb the fluid with it, and that will create more volume in the system, and that will create more higher pressure in the cardiovascular system because there's more fluid there. But that's just not true. If you provide your body with more minerals in the form of sea salts and things like that, it actually can let go of minerals easier because we're supplying it with minerals. It doesn't have to hold on to them. And there's actually studies that show this. So when you give yourself more minerals, that the body lets go of more fluid. So that would be the approach, in my opinion, to not only people who have heart failure and are retaining fluid, because that'll help the body get rid of fluid, but also to reducing um, pressure in the system. If there's high blood pressure, is to have more salt. High blood pressure is actually caused by insulin resistance,
Mm,
um, because certain mechanisms don't function well without insulin. And we also get hardening of the arteries when we have insulin resistance, which doesn't allow them to expand and contract like they're supposed to, which can change pressure in the system by expanding and contracting arteries. But it's also caused by psychological stress or an imbalance in our autonomic nervous system, where we're dysfunctional in having a stress response and returning to normal. We stay in
yes.
that stress response too long. And you can imagine if we're in a stress response, our body thinks we're in danger. It thinks we need to get away from something or fight something off. And so the body is delivering blood to the tissues more quickly. That increases pressure in the system to deliver blood more quickly. And we get this chronic state of elevated blood pressure. I also think that there's this idea that high blood pressure causes strokes or causes heart attacks, or there's a higher risk of it if you have high blood pressure. And I would argue that it's not high blood pressure that's causing those things. It's the things that cause high blood pressure that are also causing those things.
Hmm.
So because we look at all these studies that say, oh yeah, having high blood pressure gives people more risk of this, that, whatever. When in reality, it's the things causing the high blood pressure. It's the insulin resistance. It's the chronic stress. It's the inflammation. Those types of things. Those are what's causing. So taking a blood pressure medication, which I'm not telling people not to take it. I'm not allowed to do that. But taking a blood pressure medication and just artificially lowering the blood pressure, it's fine, but you didn't fix the things that are causing it, that are
Mm.
making you more likely to also have heart attacks and strokes and things like that. So it's just kind of this backwards way of thinking, when really we should be addressing the cause of the high blood pressure, because that's going to address the cause of the things you're at risk for as well.
Very interesting. Yeah, that's very interesting. It's the first time it makes sense. It's the first time I've heard that actually, but it does make sense. And I think also, again, back when this advice of salt was salt is bad or high sodium or whatever, I think it was more of a time. It's like, look, yeah, if you're telling people eat whole grains, and the person is being told to eat 4 slices of bread every day, that's high in sodium and high in gluten and everything else, high inflammation, all this kind of stuff. And then again, you're looking at, oh, they have elevated, high sodium or something, and so they blame it on salt, right? So I also think I think people like us who are eating more of a paleo diet, where we're not eating bread and pasta and processed foods that are high in sodium and things like that, right? For us, I've heard it's actually extremely important to make sure we get enough salt. So
Yeah, and the point we should make is that preservative salt is not necessarily good for us, like or
right.
table salt, like straight NaCl. That's not necessarily good. We don't want super high amounts of those. And if you're eating lots of processed foods, yeah, you're going to get lots of that.
Mm-hmm.
But mineral salt, like Himalayan salt or sea salt, those types of things they do not cause disease. We want the full array of minerals, and we want that sodium and chloride and all that stuff. And those are totally fine. Those are not causing disease at all. And I don't know that the NaCl is causing it either, but we just want balanced minerals.
Yeah.
And that's what mineral salt is. We want that.
Yeah. I like the Celtic sea salt.
Mhm.
I like that one as well. And yeah, it helps your food taste better, and
Mhm.
it's great, especially if you're exercising and your body needs those minerals. And I will say one other thing on blood pressure, because went through an experience with my father with this recently, and it's interesting, right? So he had very high blood pressure, but I tend to believe, kind of like what you said, it was really a lot due to psychological, right? He was
Mhm.
getting, it was after he retired, and then he's watching the news all day, and then he's getting angry, and he was getting frustrated, and then he had a traumatic event sort of happen to him in his life, and his high blood pressure went even higher. But again, maybe that's not even the cause, right? It may just be the psychological
Mhm.
stress that he was in for so long, and then with this traumatic event kind of put him over the top. And then soon after that, he ended up having a bunch of minor strokes. And I'll tell you, it's really sad, honestly, because at 75, he was like a young 75. He was playing tennis. He was, and ever since he's had the strokes, they said he had a bunch of smaller strokes, I guess. But ever since then, I'll tell you, in the last 2 years, he looks like he's aged 15 years in the last 2 years,
Mhm.
at age 81 now. He's an old 81, and I
Yeah.
can directly attribute that to the stroke. So it's like, man, like it just really shows me too, like you can't wait until it's too late. You really got to do things with your diet and mentally, right, to take care of yourself, to avoid these things in the first place.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean you can age pretty fast. Your body's been resilient for so long, and then you could have some stressful event that happens to you that you don't necessarily get over or don't process well or don't find the help you need to get through that, and you will start aging very fast, because
Mm-hmm.
psychological stress can do that to us.
Mm-hmm.
It can get stored in the body, and it can cause a lot of issues. So it's a very important aspect of attaining health. It's not just diet and exercise like everybody wants to do. It's you have to pay attention to the mental health and your stress response, and if it's a healthy one.
I agree 100%, 100%. And some people have proven that, right? Like Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, right? Not
Yeah.
very healthy eaters, but because they've kept their minds active and they have a sense of
Hmm.
purpose, and they're, waking up every day with something to look forward to and do, and have learned to manage their stress really well. They seem to sit around and read all day, and make a few decisions a year. And yeah, so I think, and so one great book that I love, it's actually called The Upside of Stress. Really great book called The Upside of Stress. I highly recommend everyone read that. And then just in general, whatever kind of spirituality, personal development, I listen to tons of audiobooks and personal development podcasts and things of that nature, and they've helped me tremendously. I've had to process losing someone very close to me recently as well, and the things I'm going through with my father, and I can't imagine where I would be if I hadn't gone through all this kind of personal development and spirituality. And yeah, so I just agree 100%. It's such a big part of health.
Yeah, and just some more tidbits for people to kind of take home is, if we're looking at stress in our life, the research shows that the stresses that cause the most damage to our health are the ones that make us feel like we're out of control or in unpredictable situations. So they did this study of this big company, and they looked at people's reported stress and the type of stress or whatever. And they found that, so people like lower down in the company who didn't have set hours or a guaranteed income or even, guaranteed job, like they felt like they could be let go any day or whatever, there's lots of turnover. Those people had the same amounts of stress, or they reported the same levels of stress as people who were higher up in the company, yet they had worse health outcomes. And the people higher up in the company had the same levels or reported the same amounts of stress, but their stress was in their control, right? They were making the decisions in the company. They were, they had set pay, they had set hours, they could take time off. Like they had just as much stress, maybe different types of stress, but they were in control of it. And so that's the biggest factor. So when you look into your life and say, what things can I mitigate to help me be healthier as far as stress goes, it's what stresses cause you to feel like you're out of control or in unpredictable situations. Get rid of those if you can. Obviously, you can't sometimes,
Right.
But or at least another thing is change your perception of stress.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because lots of times, we're the only species in the planet that can think our way into a stress response.
Right.
Without anything stressful ever having happened to us. We could see it happen to someone else and fear is going to happen to us, or just think that it could happen in general and think our way into that stress response. So, and then it's like almost like going down the road, like, what if that did happen? Instead of sitting here in this fear state over here, what if it did happen? What would happen? Would I be okay? Would it be okay in the long run? Like think down that road, and that helps you say, okay, I have a plan now. If that did happen, I'm not so much in fear of it now. I don't want it to happen still, but
Right.
I have a plan afterwards if it did. And so that helps you, kind of control that perception of stress.
I like that a lot. And that's the book, The Upside of Stress, that I mentioned. It really helps you reframe how you look at it, right? Because like you said, a lot of time, like what is stress? Stress is, if you think about it, right? Like what is stress? Stress is different for each person. It's a mental construct in many ways, right? Like what's stressful for someone might not be stressful for Elon Musk at all, right? And what's stressful
Yeah.
for, so you really, and in the book they talk about, a little bit of stress is a good thing, right? Working out at the gym is a little bit of stressful. It's a good thing. So like maybe if you reframed, if you didn't say, oh, I'm so stressful, oh, this is so bad, this is so hard over every little thing, and you reframe that and approach it differently and have a different mindset about it, you can literally have less stress even going through the same activities by reframing, like you said, changing your perception about it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, that's really good stuff. So I did want to also ask you, I know we got to wrap up soon, but I did want to ask you also, you mentioned about the heart being a pump, but you're saying that's not necessarily true. There's a whole kind of thought process around how people think about it. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of a big topic, but in the short answer is that the heart is not really this pressure propulsion pump. So a pressure propulsion pump is something that sucks in fluid from some area and then forcefully pumps it somewhere else. And that's not what the heart is doing. It doesn't operate that way. And the evidence we have for this is quite robust. And I cited a lot of it in my book. But basically the heart it's this contracting thing. It does do some contracting. It does do a very small amount of pumping, but no more pumping than is necessary to just move the blood kind of through the chambers of the heart. There's no way, if you looked at the size of our heart and the force that it creates, that it could pump blood forcefully throughout the entire body. There's no way that, I mean, if I was going to pump blood up a hill, like from my feet up to my heart again, I wouldn't put the pump at the top of the hill, let the water go down and then pump it back up. That's just not, physics doesn't make sense that way. Right. And so to understand this, we have to understand that the blood is more or less moving on its own. Because of mechanisms so water has the ability to hold energy. And when it does, it actually structures itself into what's been called this fourth state of water. The solid liquid gas. This is more like a gel. It's kind of between solid and liquid. And when it does this on the lining of arteries, it creates an energy gradient that actually propels flow of fluid. And this is all coming out of the lab of Dr. Gerald Pollack's lab in University of Washington. They're showing that water has these abilities. And so they've done this experimentally. They've stopped the heart of different animals and noticed that the blood continues to flow for up to 3-4 hours after the heart stops. They've recently done it in chick embryos, where they stop the heart and the blood continues to flow as long as they put radiant energy into the system. So the water absorbs energy, it structures itself on the lining of the arteries that propels the blood. And so if we look at the heart as this thing that's sitting in the middle of this system where water's already, or blood, which half blood is half water, is flowing through it, then it's placed in the middle of this flow. So that means the heart acts more like a hydraulic ram, or hydraulic ram, quote unquote, pump, which is something I didn't even know what that was when I first read it. I had to go look it up or look at YouTube videos to tell me what a hydraulic ram was. But it operates based on flow. So if something's flowing into it, it flows into certain chambers and pressure changes, and it actually moves the fluid through it, just based on physics alone. There's no outside energy source needed, besides, at least in a hydraulic ram, there's really no, besides the flow of water down from gravity. And the heart does do some contracting, but it does so in a spiral like nature, so it vortexes the blood while it goes through there. And this makes complete sense when we look at like heart failure, because people with heart failure, it's assumed that their heart is not pumping blood like it's supposed to, but that's not actually what's going on. What's going on is that they don't have enough radiant energy or health of the arterial lining for blood to flow on its own, and blood starts to get backed up in places, and that causes an enlargement of the heart, because the heart is forced to do more pumping action than it's designed to or evolved to, and that causes issues. That's why we get swelling in the feet with heart failure and things like that. And then the thing that really solidifies this whole idea is that when you look at the studies of people with heart failure and infrared sauna use, when they use infrared therapy, their symptoms dramatically reduce. And sometimes heart failure even goes away completely.
Wow.
Which tells me that when you apply radiant energy to the water in the body, and that energizes enough that it can structure itself on the lining of the arteries, creating blood flow, takes pressure off the heart failure goes away. And so, I don't understand why it's not talked about more in heart failure circles or in hospital systems, like why there's not an infrared sauna in every cardiac rehab center everywhere, because of the research on it. It's just so robust in this area. So yeah, this whole idea, it totally transforms our thinking about what the heart actually does, and why it's there. So yeah.
Wow. It's been hot out here in the summer. I haven't used my infrared sauna in the last week or two because it's 100 and something degrees out here, but you're making me want to jump back in after this.
Well, the sun's rays are 40% infrared. So
there you go.
That makes sense evolutionarily. That's why we have these mechanisms, because that's where we were getting it. But you can also get energy from being in contact with the earth, like grounding.
Yes.
or drinking water, fresh water from springs or whatever, because it's going to be energized, or eating very fresh food because the water in that food is going to be energized. So there's lots of different places you can get this energized water, or energize the water in your body. But yeah, so go out in the sun instead of sitting in the sauna, because that's just as good.
Yeah, great. I did actually go out and took my shirt off in the sun and had my bare feet in the grass, doing a little grounding this morning until the sprinklers turned on, and then I had to run off for a minute, but got a good 10-15 minutes in. So yeah, this has been great, Dr. Stephen. Thank you so much. I highly recommend everyone get his new book called Understanding the Heart, by Dr. Stephen Hussey. Sorry. How can people follow you if they want to learn more from you?
Yeah, so my website is resourceyourhealth.com. People can find my blog and my books, and I do my health coaching, my online health coaching through there, so people can find me there. I'm also on social media, on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, just Dr. Stephen Hussey. People can find me and contact me there, and I post things about the heart and things I found all the time. So
great. Well, thank you so much. This has been really eye-opening. There's not a lot of people talking about this. Everything you said, based on the thousands or tens of thousands of hours of research and study that I've done on health, everything you said makes a lot of sense to me. And I also haven't heard very many people talk about it. So thank you for spreading the word. I think it's really important information. It's going to take people like you to continue spreading this information, probably for many years, to change the narrative here in the country. But at least we're on the right path with people like you. So really appreciate everything you're doing and everything you're teaching, and encourage people to follow you. And yeah, man, keep up the great work. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Thanks for listening. And just a reminder, if you haven't yet tried any of our Peak Performance products, you get 20% off your first order. We have one of the largest selection of USDA certified organic superfood powders, as well as very high quality supplements. And you get 20% off your first order at buypeakperformance.com. That's www.buypeakperformance.com.